The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Demystifying Millennials, what motivation research can tell us about bridging the generation gap. We're so excited to have you here with us today. Thanks for taking the time. My name is Lucy Sullivan, and I'll be your host today. And before we begin and get started on this content, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, so don't worry. You will receive a link to the recording. You'll get the slide deck, and there will also be a blog post, something kind of new that we're doing where you get to see a little bit of a wrap-up of the webinar and some of the Q&A from the session, so you get to see a peek at what other people were asking about, and you'll get that all in your email. Due to the size of the audience joining us today, everyone's in listen-only mode right now, but we do want to hear from you absolutely throughout the webinar. So you can go ahead and type your questions or comments in the question box in that webinar navigation tool. We'll get to them as many as we can during the session today. Any that we don't get to during the hour, we'll answer them offline to make sure that you get your question answered. And as I mentioned, we'll put them into that blog post that we'll email to you, so you'll be able to see your question and others there. So please don't hesitate to just pop those in as they occur to you. You don't need to wait for the Q&A periods to do that. And I will give you just a quick introduction of who MRG is. Some of you may be newer joining us. MRG is a global leader in assessment design that impacts people in profound and meaningful ways. Our research-backed instruments and action-inspiring feedback reports help foster a deep self-awareness. That's what we're all about, and really encourage people to pursue growth. Our assessments are used around the world and by over 1,500 certified practitioners. And we've been doing this for over 35 years. So a lot of data comes from what we're doing. So that's where our research comes from. We're happy to share that with you. And your presenter today is Tricia Nadav. You may have heard her on our webinars before or in presentations. Tricia is the president of MRG. She's been working with individuals, teams, and organizations for more than 30 years herself, consulting, coaching, product design, research. She's done it all. She shares our learnings around the world as a TEDx speaker, contributor to Association of Coaching magazine. She speaks at conferences. You may have recently seen her at ATD, and works with practitioners around the world. She just barely got back from Geneva in time to join us for what we're doing today. So I won't keep you any further, and I will hand things over to Tricia to get us started.
Thanks, Lucy. And I'll join Lucy by saying welcome. We're glad you could be with us. This is a fun topic. It's always good to take a look at the different ways in which we categorize people. At MRG, we have a strong belief in the individual, but we do take time to look at different ways in which we tend to group people, particularly in the workplace. So we're excited today to talk to you about our research on millennials. And so let's start with the description of what a generation is. Basically, it's a pretty loose definition. It describes a group of people who were born in the same corridor of time with the understanding that because they were born during a certain period of history, they have a set of shared experiences that influence their ways of being in the world. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of diversity within generations, but this is a way of us categorizing the effect of the evolution of world patterns and social patterns on the people who grow up in different periods of time. So we're going to start by just getting a sense of who we all are in the group. Now, the first thing that may be a little bit different for you is that there's disagreement about when generations begin and when they end. So we've taken a stand based on our own research. And so we'd like to know, what generation do you see yourself within? Silents are between 1925 and 1945 birth years. Baby boomers, 46 and 64. Gen X, roughly 65 and 80. Gen Y, millennials, the folks we're going to talk most about today, 81 to 99. And then Gen Z, just coming into the workplace, our newest members in the workplace. So take a minute and let us know which generation you feel you belong to, and we'll take a look so we can know who we are as a learning community.
Thanks, Tricia. Those responses will come in. I'll give everyone just a couple more seconds to go ahead and let us know. We have nice representation
feel free to
here.
click. Yeah, good. Feel free to click the one you feel like you most belong to, if the years don't exactly match up. But the general rule of thumb is if you're within 3 years of an abutting generation, you can sort of go either way generationally.
Okay, thanks everyone. We've got just about everyone in there, so let's look at these responses. We have 3% from the silence, welcome. 53% baby boomers, 33% Gen X, 11% Gen Y, and no one from Gen Z made it on with us today.
Not yet, not yet. They're probably still in school. So, full disclosure. So, Lucy, you want to tell people what generation you are?
I am. They actually call me a Zennial because I was born right in 1980. So I'm, as you mentioned, that kind of the time that bridges. But some would call me a millennial.
with great affection.
Yes.
I'm a baby boomer. I'm a baby boomer with 2 millennial daughters. So you know a little bit about what our personal story is. So we're here to talk about millennials, and it's a great time to talk about millennials because they are really fully coming into some leadership spaces. So we're going to share, not only as promised, the motivation research that we have, but we're also going to share the leadership research that we have. This is a growing body, an important growing body in the leadership space organizationally. So we want to talk about them from a leadership perspective. So a lot has been written about the millennials in the last 5 years in particular, not always very kind. So here's an example of the kinds of comments that sometimes get made about a younger generation. So, and it's often has some very salient, similar descriptions. So there's a level of describing the younger generation as somehow selfish or self-focused, a lack of respect for people who are older than they are, or at least not taking them as seriously as the older generation would hope, a level of impatience, wanting things quicker than older generations believe is wise, and also believing that they've got an access to a level of wisdom that the older generation questions. So this is pretty common. Interestingly, this comment in particular was made by Socrates. So this feeling of how we look at the younger generation with perhaps a little bit of a humph or an eye roll or a shaking of the head is at least 2,400 years old. Lucy and I are big fans of musical theater, so I couldn't resist this. So if any of you have had the opportunity to see this on stage or the movie, Bye Bye Birdie had a great song. It was written in 1960 by Charles Strauss and Lee Adams. This is one of the verses, and it was a common reflection about the frustration of the emergence of kids in the late 50s and early 60s, with a very common refrain from the older generation, which is why can't this younger generation be more like we were? And probably a set of rose-colored glasses about an inflated sense of self historically for the older generation, the belief that the way we did it was right and the way we did it was good. So there's a long-standing history about this, as we see from both the Socrates comment and that it even shows its way into entertainment, but it also shows its way quite significantly in media. So this is the cover of Life magazine in May 17th, 1968, really beginning the big declaration about the generation gap, with the early baby boomers in that generation really beginning to behave very differently than their parents who were in the silent generation. There were protests, there was long hair, there was different kinds of clothes, there was strange kind of music, and there was this very strong claim about the gap that was growing between the silent generation and the baby boomer generation. It continued into 1976. This is the cover of the New York magazine, and so this is reflecting the coming in of the later baby boomers, and was called the me generation or the me decade coming in. That again, this baby boomer generation, as it continued to grow, was very self-focused in comparison to at least the silent generation's perception of self. Gen X doesn't get away without this painted brush of a self-centered generation. We see this in Newsweek. This is the cover of Newsweek, December 30th, 1985. This is, I wonder what the writers of this would have thought if we had showed them what the selfie culture was going to look like. But this was the advent of the video culture coming, and Gen X bringing in this wanting to record everything that was happening. Even though it was pre-cell phone, we had no idea where we were headed. And then again, in July of 1990, Time magazine writes again about Gen X and reflecting that they are more narcissistic, they are less apt to want to have careers like their baby boomer parents had. They want to go off and join the Peace Corps or climb the Himalayas, and they have some version of attention deficit because of how many TV channels there are. They saw a lot of their parents divorce, their baby boomer parents divorce, baby boomers divorce at a much higher rate than silence did, and so these people were postponing marriage. Right. So then we turn to Time magazine again. This is 2013, and now we're calling the millennials the me generation. So why do we share this? It's just a reminder that we tend to critique the younger generation in pretty in less flattering ways, and we are quite focused on how self-centered they appeared to be relative to the generation or generations before them. So this is a common refrain, and so I want to just put in perspective this refrain that we're hearing about the millennials and how frequently they have been reported on the generations before them. This is not new. So let's talk about these folks at work. Let's talk about the impact that the social impact on each generation and how that impacts their ways of working. So first, I'd like you to just reflect. We're too large a group to get stories, although I'd love to hear stories. But think about when you were a teenager. Think about you're coming into your teenage years, 12 and 13, coming into that space, through the time that for many of us were our early years at college or university, 18, 19, what was happening in the world around you. So you can imagine, you can think about what your high school yearbook picture looked like, what were the hairstyles, what were the fashions, what were you listening to music-wise, what was your taste in entertainment, what were you reading, what were you listening to, what was happening in your sort of social world. What was happening in the broader world? So what might you have heard in the news? What was capturing the attention? What might you have been talking to your peers about? Or what might you have been hearing your parents' generation talk about? What was happening politically? What was happening socially in the world around you? What were your parents' expectations? What were you encouraged to do? What were you discouraged from doing? Where were the rewards and punishments, both subtle and more overt? What were your parents' hopes for you? And then overall, how did your upbringing affect your identification with your gender? How did you see yourself in association with your peers? What was happening in the systems you participated in, whether it was a school system, a community system, a religious system, an extracurricular set of systems? How did all of that influence your way of being in the world, and what felt right and what felt wrong, what felt like you belonged to and what felt foreign to you? So let's look at some commonality by generation. So let's look at the baby boomers to start with. Again, baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964. So what was happening for them? So primarily, baby boomers were raised in a pretty traditional gender-based structure. The mother stayed at home, the father went to work. Their parents often had very specific gender roles of what they did and didn't do. There was a lot happening in the world. There were big issues in the world: Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, dealing with Vietnam and Watergate. but there were also tremendous social changes happening. Peace movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement. There was a lot afoot for social change. There was the unsettling nature of the assassinations that happened during coming of age time for baby boomers, but there was also very interesting things happening in science, and in particular, the space travel is something that many baby boomers know where they were when there was the moonwalk. So it was an interesting time where you could really feel upheaval and change occurring. So how did this impact boomers when they came into the workplace? So baby boomers came in with a tremendous amount of ambition. They watched their silent parents be in more paternalistic organizations, and baby boomers wanted more for themselves. They believed that the harder they worked, the higher they should come in the ranking. They had, but an interesting sort of duality in the way that they thought of work. On the one hand, the social movement encouraged baby boomers to question authority. However, they both in an organizational life would be very loyal, so they weren't moving about organizationally, and they would wait to be noticed and rewarded. So it was an interesting seesaw around why are things the way they are, but I'm also going to be patient and stay with this organization. Baby boomers had a lot of their most important relationships at work. This was the growing of political correctness. What could we say and not say as a result of the social movements that happened? And these folks are the first to redefine retirement. Hanging on longer, staying on longer lifespans, so longer need to work financially, but also more impassioned in their work and therefore wanting to stay in the work longer than their parents did. So Gen X comes along, born 1965 to 1980. What was life like for these folks? Really different than the baby boomers. Much more access to different kinds of media. These folks, their parents, often more of them had both parents working, so more of them were latchkey kids. Their baby boomer parents, as we said before, were experiencing a much higher rate of divorce. They saw the collapse of communism. They saw the spread of AIDS. They saw the energy crisis. They saw long-term employment as less certain. A lot of their parents got laid off with mergers and acquisitions and downsizing. So they were less enamored with the idea of organizations being safe and long-term places to be. They were, however, the social change during their time was a little bit more stable. So they had less of that sort of revolutionary challenge authority space. But for them, work-life balance becomes more important. So Gen Xers are the generation who really bring in a much more emboldened way, the idea that work should not consume every aspect of you because they saw it do some damage to their parents. So who are they coming into the workplace? They are much more free agents. This is the first generation that is more likely to leave an organization if they're not pleased with the organization. Again, seeing their parents affected by downsizings and mergers and acquisitions, they're not nearly as prone to be loyal to the organization. So this is the first generation where we begin to see much more movement across organizational relationships. They are, while less likely to challenge the rules directly, they will look for ways to sidestep the rules. So this is the generation of, instead of ask for permission, apologize if you get caught. They're very self-reliant. They see work much more as a contract. They want to work smarter. They do not want to spend long hours at work. And so they're emphasizing life and the work-life balance. They tend to be very outcome-oriented. So the way we get there is less important than getting there. They're less formal and they tend to be much more pragmatic at work. This is a very interesting generation to get to know because this generation now holds the largest number of leadership roles in the organization, and higher and higher leadership roles as baby boomers are retiring. So this is the most expanded, biggest group in the leadership space right now. So the group that is really beginning to strongly influence leadership culture. So here we have our millennials, again, born 1981 to 1999, and they've been in the workplace for a while now, but they're really taking on leadership roles. So let's get an understanding of how they grew up. So this is the fastest growing workforce coming into the workforce in large numbers right now. They are very tech savvy, highly connected, global citizens. Many of these did study abroad when they were in college or university. They have access to all kinds of information, but now their information is less curated. So it's harder to tell for them what information to trust, what information is accurate, what's not accurate, as we're all dealing with the complexity of information accuracy in social media. This is the generation that grew up with the most scheduled lives. This is the generation that had the most emphasis put on them of building their, in quotes, resume from a very early age. If you wanted to get into a good college or university, going into late middle school years and high school, you needed to not only get exceptional grades, hopefully in honors classes, but also demonstrate that you had some association with the arts, some association often with a sport, some association for giving back, being in service. They had working parents so therefore these are the kids who had play dates. They weren't riding around the neighborhood with bikes on their own. They had a very highly scheduled life. They lived in the U.S. They lived through the first state of threat on U.S. Property with the 9/11 tragedy. They experienced the Great Recession, oftentimes right when they were coming out of college. They saw an increase in school violence that previous generations have not experienced. They have become very socially and environmentally conscious from a very young age. And these folks have been groomed to be successful, and they expect to be successful. This is a group that has very high expectations for themselves. They were groomed all along to be successful. They had a lot of adult involvement in their success. Teachers, coaches, parents who were hyper vigilant about the way in which they grew up, the way in which they performed, how they worked. So this is a group that has been built for achievement in a very specific way. So they get into the workplace, and what do we find? They are very energetic. They have probably the highest performance-oriented culture from a very young age, generationally. They're very goal-oriented. They're very impatient. They have high expectations, and they want to know what's next and what comes after that. They want to be included. They are impatient. They have sat at the adult table for a very long time. These kids were brought to restaurants with them, with their parents. They came into the adult world earlier than previous generations. They have been with adults that they admire, and they have therefore high expectations of the adults that they encounter in work. So they expect to work for people that they respect, that they value. They want jobs that match their values. They want jobs that build inclusivity and teamwork. They want constant feedback. They have received constant feedback for most of their lives already. They are also looking for work-life balance, but unlike the Gen X before them, they want a lot of fluidity about when they work. So they don't expect as many boundaries around work-life balance in terms of I'm going to work in these hours in the office and then I'm going to stop. They want a lot more fluidity in terms of that work-life balance. So we end up, of course, now we're talking about large amounts of people in very different circumstances, and we're lumping them all together. So I want to just take a moment and just acknowledge that we are allowing ourselves for a little bit of time to stereotype people based on the years that they are born. Now, of course, social circumstances change these dynamics. So your socioeconomic status, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your religious affiliations will all influence how you are within this body of people that you share birth years with. So we're grouping people for comparison's sake. So the first thing we want to look at then is this is a group of people who are all either have been or are in leadership roles. So what can we learn about the differences of these new people coming into this leadership role? So many of you are familiar with MRG's leadership assessment. So the first look we're going to take is how are the millennials approaching the leadership role, and how is that different than the generation before them? So let me just either remind you or introduce to you MRG's LEA assessment. So LEA stands for Leadership Effectiveness Analysis, and it's an assessment that measures 22 behaviors. So it's a behavioral-based assessment, and we organize those 22 behaviors in 6 different categories. So the first is creating a vision, and here we're looking at leadership behaviors that influence problem solving and decision making and the thinking and cognitive aspects of the leadership role. The second category is developing followership, and here we're looking at the leadership behaviors that influence getting people on side, getting people to follow you, getting people to believe in your ideas and to be compelled by your way of thinking. We then have the next two, implementing and following through, which are really the getting things done element. So implementing are the behaviors associated with getting things started in the execution phase of work, and following through are the behaviors associated with moving things to completion. The next is achieving results, and this is the behavior category that we look at achievement and power-oriented behaviors. And then the final is team playing. These are the behaviors associated with being collaborative and working alongside others. So in looking at the comparison and trying to understand the millennials, we compare them to Gen X. So Gen X, as we said before, occupying the largest number of leadership seats in organizations now. Gen Y, the group that's coming into this leadership space. So Gen Y is the other name for millennials. So it's the same group as millennials. So here we're looking at Gen X across these 22 behaviors. You see that in green, and Gen Y or millennials are in the blue. So you can see that these are not aligned. There are distinct differences in the approach to leadership with these two groups. So let's take a look at where the greatest differences live. So looking at Gen X and Gen Y, just not matching them in terms of age or any other demographics, let's look at where we see the greatest number of the greatest differences between the two approaches. So the first is persuasive. So Gen X are much more persuasive than Gen Y. So persuasive is the degree to which the leader is selling his or her ideas, making a compelling case, understanding that description alone won't win hearts and minds. So how much are you really trying to convince people by creating compelling language, compelling examples, and being very persuasive? So we see the millennials as significantly less persuasive than Gen X in this space. Outgoing, being social, being friendly, being informal. Here we see that Gen Y, the millennials, are more outgoing. So Gen X actually are outgoing. It's just that Gen Y is very outgoing. So they are more friendly, more informal, more social in their leadership space. Interesting that Gen Y, the millennials, are also more structured than Gen X. So what does that mean? It means they are developing procedures and processes and systems as ways of getting things done in their leadership role. This isn't surprising when we reflect back and remember that millennials are so far the generation that has been most structured in their upbringing and really structured as it relates to getting a lot done. This was the generation that tended to be overscheduled, so they developed earlier on better, more effective ways of structuring for a very packed schedule from very early years. Gen Y millennials are also delegating much less than Gen X. So they are much lower on both delegating and giving freedom to others to accomplish things, but also less likely to ask for help when they are putting their heads down and getting work done. Gen Y is giving less feedback as a leader than the Gen X. So feedback in our scale is how the degree to which you're being very direct and straightforward and letting people know how you're doing, how you're performing, and what the leader's opinion of is your work. So the millennials are less frequently giving feedback. Gen Y millennials are very focused on production. Production in our model is very focused on setting very ambitious goals for yourself and others. So being very drawn to the stretch goal and really focusing on achievement in a very ambitious way, both for self and for others. So Gen Y is pushing in this production space more than the Gen X. Cooperation. Cooperation is how helpful you are, how willing you are to help others, how willing you are to accommodate, how willing you are to compromise. And in this, we see millennials are more cooperative in their leadership space than Gen X. They are also, Gen Y is more consensual, and what that means is they're more likely to seek input from others, value other people's input, and use other people's input in their decision making, in their planning, in their thinking. It doesn't mean, as you can see as we look at Gen X is not low on these behaviors where Gen Y is higher. They're more moderate. And then finally, we see empathy. And for empathy, we see that, once again, millennials are higher than Gen X. So again, Gen X, moderate in their approach to empathy, caring, nurturing, kind. Gen Y, higher. So one of the questions that we got very interested in is how much of what we call generational differences are really age differences, differences in personal levels of growth and maturity and professional levels of growth and maturity based on how long you've been in the workplace. So one way to explore that question is to look at two generations when they were actually at the same age. And because, as Lucy mentioned in her introduction, MRG's been around for a long time, we have quite a bit of data, we're able to look at different generations when they were the same age. And so we'll stick with the same combination of Gen X and Gen Y, and we'll look at them when they're matched. All right, so what does it mean by being matched? We looked at Gen X when they were the same age as our current sample of Gen Y. So this is Gen X when they were between the ages of 25 and 35, and Gen Y, millennials, between the ages of 25 and 35. So what happens when we look at approach to leadership when these two generations are at the same age? So persuasive, we remember that Gen Y is not as persuasive as Gen X. What happens when Gen X was this age? They were not as persuasive as they are in older years, but they're still at the same age more persuasive than millennials. How about outgoing? Gen X, when they were younger, they were more outgoing. And so that difference goes away between the two generations. Structuring, Gen X was more structured when they were younger as well, and so that difference is no longer relevant when they're at the same age. Delegation, we see that the millennials are not delegating very much. When Gen X was their age, neither were they. So that generational difference goes away. Feedback, Gen Y currently is not giving as much feedback as Gen X, but when Gen X was their age, they were not giving as much feedback either, so that difference goes away. Production, Gen Y, higher on production. Gen X, they are the same as when they were younger. So Gen Y, that is a generational differences that manages to stay with the age comparison. Gen Y, higher on cooperation. When Gen X was younger, they were higher on cooperation as well. So that answer goes away, that difference goes away. Gen Y, higher on consensual, asking for input. Gen X, when they were younger, they were not asking for as much input. That generational difference stays. Finally, empathy. Gen X was more empathetic when they were younger, and so that generational difference goes away. So here we are. We started with 9 differences that we would have ascribed to generation, but when we look at Gen X when they were the same age, we see that they had many of the same characteristics. And so all we're left with are 3 differences that are truly generational differences. Gen Y, less persuasive, less oriented to creating that compelling, winning hearts and minds. They are more production oriented. We are assuming that has to do with their upbringing being very production oriented, and more consensual, seeking input more, probably having to do with working very collaboratively, growing up on teams, both academically in sports and in extracurricular activities. So another way to look at the differences, to see how much of it is age and how much of it is generation, is to look at the same generation but split the generation by age. So look at younger members of the generation compared to older members of the generation. So here we bring in Gen X and look at the split. We have Gen X folks who are 35 and older. We see that in green. And we have Gen X who are under 35 in blue. And here you can see that there are some differences. The most significant there are 5. The first one is persuasive. So you get more persuasive. This generation got more persuasive as it got older. The next one is outgoing. This, like our Gen Y, our millennial folks, they became less outgoing as they got older. Structuring, again, they became less structuring as they got older. Delegation, they started delegating more as leaders as they got older. And then finally, consensual, they actually became more consensual as they got older. Still, however, not quite as consensual as Gen Y. So you can see that another way of looking at this by splitting a single generation by age is that age tends to influence our approach to leadership, our approach to even probably organizational citizenship, more than generation does. That's not to say that there aren't generational differences. We saw in the past slide that there are some generational differences, but they are small compared to the differences we see when we look at age. So let's take a look. Let's stop for a second and see what we've got for questions. I know I've sort of gone on for a while here. So Lucy, do we have questions that we want to?
We do. We have some great ones. About this research, which of course is fascinating. One question is persuasive. What do you think is behind that low persuasive score in our Gen Y friends?
I think that's a great question. So here's the hypothesis. These millennials were raised with such high expectations for performance. It wasn't about changing hearts and minds. And there wasn't also, when they were growing up, unlike the baby boomers, there wasn't a lot of dramatic social change that was happening in mass. So their work was more put your heads down and perform. It was less about changing the structures they were in. Quite frankly, many of them were so overscheduled, there wasn't really much room for considering other alternatives. So I think this is a group that we're seeing the byproduct of being overscheduled, highly performance oriented, very high ambitious goals, and just kind of put your head down and do the work and juggle all the things that you're supposed to juggle in order to get that done. So I think it is a skill set that wasn't actually nurtured in them from a very early age. It's my hypothesis.
Thanks. Another question is, how much of what is showing up in these differences might be related to how explicit the organization is in their expectation for the characteristics? An example the question asker provided is, if an organization hasn't said feedback is important, how likely is it that somebody will then display that?
I think that's a great question. And I think what we all know from organizations is the larger they are, often the more challenging it is for them to be explicit. You know, we've been talking for eons on what does good leadership look like and how do we promote effective leadership. So I think that we are seeing these influences based on age, in part because there isn't a more dominant influence on what should leadership look like. And if we go even further and think about how much we're even training young people to be effective leaders as they are growing up, they're not getting a lot of instruction on effective leadership. So they're sort of coming in the best way they know how, as is sort of assumed in the question that's asked, into organizations that are pretty vague about what effective leadership is. And even organizations that have a point of view about that, oftentimes we don't see behavior that's always consistent with that idealized point of view. So yes, I think that, I think these millennials are coming in with a high amount of interest to learn and grow. I think that they're very interested in growing professionally and becoming better at what they do. So I think they are really good candidates to be in good developmental programs. We just need to help them find organizations that have those.
Thanks. There are a couple more requests for hypotheses, but I am going to probably hold those till the end just to make sure you have time to get through the rest of the content, and then we'll get to those if we have time. So I'll let you move on. Thanks,
Great.
everyone. But keep those questions coming. We will get answers to you.
Yeah, thanks. That was what I was going to say, Lucy. Thank you for that.
Great minds.
Okay, so great. So let's talk about the motivational differences, because there's some really interesting patterns when we look at motivational differences. So many of you are probably familiar with MRG's motivational assessment, the IDI, the Individual Directions Inventory. So unlike the LEA, which measures leadership behavior, and where we often, when we do research, as we did in the last set that we showed you, look at observer perceptions of behavior, here we're asking individuals to talk about what motivates them. And by motivation, we're really looking at under what circumstances do you get highly engaged and energized, and in what circumstances might your energy wane faster, and in fact, it be more challenging for you to sustain your energy to participate. So this assessment has 17 variables. Again, we cluster it into 6 different groupings. The first is the set of motivations associated being with affiliating and being closely connected to others. The next being associated with motivations associated with attracting positive attention to yourself. The third being motivation associated with how you perceive information, knowledge, and how you work with ideas. The fourth being mastering, and these are motivational energies associated with achievement. The next one is challenging, and these are the motivational components associated with what happens when you are challenged or face obstacles. What happens to your energy in that space? And the last set is the energy associated with maintaining boundaries in the way that you like. So how you are energized to keep your life, your way of being in the world, the way that you want it. So here we look at all 3 generations that are the most active in the leadership space right now: baby boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y. Baby boomers in the dark blue, Gen X in the green, and Gen Y, or our dear millennials, in blue. And so what I want to highlight here is, where are the millennial motivations unique and distinct? And there are 5 that are really good for us to know, because if we understand how people are motivated in the workplace, we can help them architect their participation in work, and in particular their participation in leadership, in a way that's more likely to be both successful for them and sustainable for them. And when we think about motivation as it relates to teams, it helps us work more effectively together when we understand how we're each motivated. So let's first look at a pattern associated with the millennials as we group them together. So the first distinction we see is these millennials are less motivated by expressing, and expressing is the motivation associated with being spontaneously letting people know what you're feeling and what you're thinking, and sort of just being less watchful and less careful about how you express yourself. So millennials, I think, were so very structured and had very specific ideas about what success looked like. We see them a little bit less free energetically to, I'm going to say, let it all hang out, right? That's a very baby boomer thing. And as you can see here, just as an aside, our baby boomers are the highest in this space. Millennials, however, have a lot of motivation for entertaining. They actually are very drawn to attracting positive attention to themselves. They're a little bit higher on gaining stature, that the one that's right next to it, but they are much higher in the entertaining. So liking to be the center of attention, enjoying giving people a positive experience when they are the center of attention. They are also higher on the motivation of excelling. So this goes along with the production behavior we saw earlier. This is the motivation to achieve, to excel, to be top of the class, to really be very achievement oriented. So stretch goals, ambitious assignments, maybe even audacious goals. These folks are very energized by. They're also very energized by structuring, and we saw this behaviorally as well. They are energized by having a specific way of doing things, to organize themselves, to be efficient in their work processes. And finally, they're less motivated by being independent, less motivated by being self-reliant and off on their own. And I want to draw your attention to a combination here where we see their affiliating scores are, while not necessarily distinct, they are relatively high. So giving, receiving, belonging. This is a group that wants to be connected. They are energized when they are involved and included, working on teams, working with others. They get less energized and less motivated when they are isolated. So when we're thinking of coaching and leading and managing these folks, these are important dynamics for us to understand, because these are the energetic levers that will influence performance and participation for these folks. So back to MRG's roots. We do love doing this research. We really value the opportunity to use our data to understand patterns across groups of people. But our biggest set of values are about individual uniqueness and understanding people at a very individual level. So knowing what motivates people at the high end tells you a lot about where they're likely to gain the most energy, therefore where they're likely to be the most successful, and where they're likely to be able to sustain their participation. Understanding where they are less energized tells you a lot about where it's harder for them to sustain energy, where they're less likely to want to spend a lot of time, and where, if we're directing them to be there for a long time, they're less likely to be satisfied. So while it is absolutely important to understand generational differences, we have to be very careful that we don't get lured into stereotyping and say, I know who you are because I know what generation you belong in, or I know what age you are. So it is important to understand individual motivational differences so that we can coach people and develop people at a very individual level, help people be successful at that very individual level. I do want to tell you just a quick little story about a team that we worked with. And how a millennial influenced this group, and how a Gen X leader learned as a result of working with motivational differences to lead better across their organization, and also be a better leader to this high potential millennial. So our high potential millennial here is in blue. We'll call her Cece. And she has some motivations that are very stereotypical of millennials, but also some that are different. Our leader is DJ. You can see, it's easier to see DJ here because it's also a woman. She is out on her own over here. So let's look at some things that really influence this. This is a page out of MRG's IDI team report. So we love the IDI. We love what it does at an individual level. We also love what it does at a team level. So this is a team profile looking at how their energy influences how they make decisions. And so one of the things that was very interesting for them is to look at DJ the boss and CC the millennial, why they loved having conversations together, because they both had a lot of energy for this interpreting, looking at a lot of data and facts and doing a lot of analysis. They're both mid-range on the energy for creating, so having some energy to look at things in new and different ways. This in a way was a validation of what they experienced. They loved their conversations, a lot of this idea generation. One of the things that this team was working on is that potentially they were, when they were making decisions, they may have been overly concerned about the people aspect of the decisions, and it stalled them out a lot. And so when they saw their giving results, which is the energy that comes from being nurturing and kind and supportive, it really made them think about, are we placing too much emphasis on this filter when we're making decisions, and in fact not taking enough risks, and in fact being too paternal maternalistic. And here they were in the excelling space. Two things came up for this millennial, that you can see that Cece is the lowest of the giving, although not low on giving. She's mid-range and far and away out ahead on excelling. So what this meant from the team perspective in decision making is Cece, in her very vibrant millennial voice, was saying, why aren't we pushing harder? Why aren't we being more ambitious? Why are we being so careful? I don't think people are going to be as overwhelmed as you think they are. And so what was at one point, I think, a very occasionally seen as an annoying voice in this team of, she's just not mature enough. She doesn't understand the impact of people. In this, we were able to explore that perhaps while sometimes a little overly enthusiastic about ambition, that perhaps she was a really important voice for this group to be a bit bolder. And a final piece just to share is that an insight that DJ had as the leader was that gaining stature was not important to her. And so gaining stature is the energy you get from external validation of what you're bringing to the table. People saying they value your contribution, you're really doing good work, you're an important member of the team. So because she didn't need it, she wasn't offering that to the group very frequently. And as you can see, she has a team of people who are very high on gaining stature with one who's mid-range. And so she learned from this that one, she was wondering why the millennial always needed so much positive reinforcement. She actually learned there were multiple members of her team who would stay more energized if she gave them more positive feedback. So she did a lot of work on one, shedding herself and thinking that Cece was just because she was young and a millennial, needed a lot of reinforcement, and understanding that she could get more out of her team if she just acknowledged their good work. So anyway, that's an example of an interesting dynamic that was both interesting and helpful for the leader of this team. It also helped the millennial, I think, get some more validation, and it helped the team understand each other, I think, a little bit better. So bottom line, much of what we observe in millennials that we think is generational has much more to do with personal and professional maturity, and it has been the same for every generation. Just a reminder for all of us, it can be very compelling to go into that stereotypical categorization, but the individual millennials we encounter, none of them are going to align with what we see when we look at the group as a whole. So 6 tips for helping millennials. The first one, ask them questions to draw out deeper insights. Remember, their motivation for expressing is lower. They were built, I think, a little bit more to put their heads down and just get the work done. And they were also surrounded by adults that interpreted them for themselves. So they got a lot of feedback and a lot of reflection, which is in part why they need that organizationally. But we in part need to coach them to bring their voices forward and bring their self-awareness forward more independently. Give them opportunities to be in the spotlight. You know, these kids did class presentations, and they're used to being out in front. They're used to having, you know, class rankings, and they do well in the spotlight. Don't be concerned that you're over stroking their ego. This happens to be a lever that's useful with them. They will perform well when they're acknowledged and they get to be in the front of the room. Don't be afraid to give these folks stretch goals. They've had stretch goals most of their lives. They are energized by them. And if they get good support, they do really well with stretch goals. Keep them connected to the organization and their teams. They thrive in connection, and they tend not to do as well when they're isolated. And in our very busy, overworked organization, it is very easy for folks to feel isolated. Coach them on persuasive skills. You know, the really nice thing about some of the things that these folks need to develop, in particular this persuasive skill, is it's a behavior. It is something that is a skill that is pretty straightforward to get coached on. So help them develop in that space, and provide good training on delegation and feedback. This is something that, again, these are both relatively straightforward skill sets to develop, and we can accelerate the millennials' growth in the leadership space by helping them in this way. These are folks that, while loving inclusion, also can be prone to getting too stuck in an individual contributor space. So that delegation and feedback, particularly as they move into leadership roles, will really help them see how to use others' talents and how to encourage others' talents. So a little bit of a tip sheet for you if you're coaching or managing millennials. So we have more research to share on this and other topics. So Luce, I'll turn it over to you to guide us the rest of the way.
Sure. We could probably do one quick question. I want to be conscious of everyone's time, but we have some great ones. Can you comment on, somebody observed an interesting combination. Millennials are high in production and excelling. Does that put them on the road to burnout potentially? Is that going to be a struggle for them?
That's a great observation. Absolutely, it puts them on the road to burnout. And we even see it now. You know, the millennials were, and we're also seeing it with Gen Zs. You know, they were a stressed out group of kids. We tended to overschedule them. We tended to over promote success. We tended to over promote this multi-dimensional way of being in terms of all the broad range of expectations they had. So, I mean, they were stressed out kids, and there can be stressed out workers. So absolutely. And that is why we have to be particularly attentive to the other aspects of their motivation, which is a lot about connectivity and a lot about reinforcement. This group of people, I think more than Gen X and baby boomers, are really good. They'll be really good coachees. Right? They're really, they want to learn and grow, and they want to get better. And so I think part of that is going to be coaching them on the boundaries of achievement, and building a little bit more holistic way of thinking about their life and their well-being. It's a great observation.
Thanks. All right, I will close us out very quickly now since we're right at the end of the hour. Some opportunities to see and spend time with MRG. We actually have the MRG Summit coming up right where our home office is in Portland, Maine, and there's still a little bit of room to join us. The 19th, 20th, and 21st we have events, but the main summit is on June 20th. So you can find more about that on the MRG.com calendar. That's going to be a terrific day. We also have plenty of certifications coming up in the LEA 360 and in the IDI. We also have some of those here in Portland, Maine. Maine. So if you want to visit us, that's a pretty beautiful time to be here. Those are starting August 19th and then August 21st for the IDI. We'd love to have you here. We have a presentation at the MECO conference, which is a terrific coaching conference out in San Diego. That's in the fall. And we're always happy to hear from you, answer more questions. If you didn't get a chance to put your question in the box or you're thinking about it and have more, please feel free to get in touch. We are always happy to continue having this conversation with you. As you can tell, Trisha's quite passionate about this topic and all our topics. So we're always happy to keep those conversations going, take your suggestions for new topics. You'll get a survey in your email along with the slide deck, the video, and that blog post with your questions answered. So please fill out the survey too and let us know what you thought and what else you might like to see from us on webinars. So with that, I will let everyone get on with their day. Thank you again so much for joining us, and please stay in touch.